My name is Seth Jones. I'm the Harold Brown Chair and the Director of the Transnational Threats Project, and I am extremely happy to welcome Bob Hutchings to my left and Greg Treverton to my right to discuss their book, Truth to Power, A History of the U.S. National Intelligence Council, which, if you can tell by the bookmarks on the top of the book, not only have I read it, but I have taken notes on it. So I would encourage everybody in the room and watching online that they do the same. It's an interesting book. We'll focus on a range of the issues that are in the book, as well as some of the implications more broadly. So here are the ground rules. We're going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then we're going to open this up to Q&A with you folks. If you could just make sure when the microphones come that you're asking a question, a short question, and not a monologue, that would be great. Otherwise, I will interrupt you. In addition, after we're done, Greg and Bob are available and happy to sign any books. Their book is for sale at CSIS behind us or behind you, and they're happy to sign it. So I guess without further ado, I wanted to start by first asking Bob a little bit to provide some historical background here. If you could start us off by talking a little bit about the establishment of the National Intelligence Council. What were the factors that contributed to the establishment of what became the NIC? Why was it viewed as necessary, and what are the key issues it attempted to?
Sure. Well, it's actually a two-part answer, because the first answer is how the predecessor to the NIC got established, namely by Harry Truman in 1946. He issued National Intelligence Authority Directive number 1 to the newly created National Intelligence Authority, a body that was quickly morphed into the Director of Central Intelligence, and instructed that individual to accomplish the provision of strategic intelligence analysis. And he deliberately put that function not in the Pentagon, not in the Department of State, not in the NSC, which was just being created, but apart from all of those things, under the Director of Central Intelligence. So that established the sort of the principle that intelligence analysis was to be 1 degree removed from policymaking, on grounds that policymakers tend to want to skew the intelligence to suit their policy preferences. So it created a deliberate and built-in tension between intelligence and policy. And that tension, that gave rise to the title we chose for the book, Truth to Power. It's happened in every administration, under every chairman. It appears in every chapter of the book in one guise or another. Sometimes that conflict is cordial and collegial. Other times it's contentious. So that body, the Director of Central Intelligence, then created the old Board for National Estimates, the precursor to the NIC. That body had sometimes looked back upon as the golden age of estimate writing. I think one could debate that point, but that's the way it was looked at. That body also developed the not so positive reputation of Olympian detachment. They were out in Langley, physically distant, psychologically distant from policymakers. They would deliver estimates and other analyses ex cathedra, as if their word on the subject should be the last word to be heard. They got into trouble, increasing criticism, some intelligence failures, but increasing criticism certainly from Henry Kissinger, but by no means only Henry Kissinger. To make a long story short, in the 70s, in a couple of DCI administrations, it morphed into first the NIO system, about a dozen national intelligence officers, a very loose arrangement, which a few years later was condensed into a National Intelligence Council. And that was in 1979. That structure has been more or less the same ever since. There's other changes in the intelligence community, but there's a sort of a long line, a long lineage of this basic issue of telling truth to power.
Greg, if I can ask you to talk a little bit about your sense of what truth means in this sense, and how and what the goal of the intelligence community, including the National Intelligence Council, to unearthing truth. And I'm just going to read the Principles of Professional Ethics for the Intelligence Community, 2014, which Bob quotes in the introduction. We seek the truth, small t, speak truth to power, and obtain, analyze, and provide intelligence objectively. So what is, in this sense, what's the goal of finding truth here?
It's interesting. I've always been struck by the line carved into the main entrance of the CIA building, the line from John, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." I've always found that curious and curiously located, because we know that while there may be divine truth, in intelligence there's not absolute truth. It's trying to do as good as you can, and objective as good as you can. And it also intrigues me because often the intelligence truth constrains policy, not set people free. So the effort, I think, is to tell the truth as best we can, and maybe you like to get it right, but you know you're not going to get it right all the time. So in some sense, I think the better standard is, was this analysis useful to policy? Mm-hmm. Even if did it result in or it contribute to wiser policy, even if it wasn't exactly right. And we know that for those hard questions, mysteries, those questions that don't have answers, that are iffy, that are contingent, we're not always going to get it right.
So building on, Bob, building on Greg mentions policy. One of the comments that Joe Nye brings up in his chapter is a challenge that he identifies in dealing with policymakers. And I'll read this part because he says most high-level policymakers are swamped with information and have little time to read. They spend their days drinking from a fire hose of information. And then he talks about a paradox that he'd experienced, which is that the government rests on a sea of paper, but the higher you go, the more it becomes an oral culture. So does that work in some cases against, estimates, NIEs, for example, which can be, depending on which administration, where it's somewhat lengthy? I mean, how do you deal with getting information and thinking about getting information of policymakers that, especially at high levels, may be less interested in reading through it?
Yeah, you and Joe hit on the problem. There's been various devices to make these long documents more accessible. There was the executive summary, which started off small, then got larger. So it started off as a couple of pages, then often they morphed into 4 or 5 pages, which is already more than the market can sometimes bear. So sometime before my tenure, there was a new art form called the presidential summary, a single page. And we've spent a lot of time on that. I know you're going to get to the notorious Iraqi WMD estimate and the leaked estimate on the Iraqi occupation, but the real story of that was that the president, who later criticized that estimate, had not read it, had not even read the one-page presidential summary. So even reducing it to 1 page may not get the job done. I think it depends a lot on who you're writing for. Now, if you're writing for senior working levels, you can get away with having people maybe even read the whole estimate, but certainly more than a page. And then if you're writing for the very senior most policymakers, you have to gauge your audience. If it's a Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama, you might expect that they would read a bit. If it's George W. Bush or the current incumbent, whose name I shall not mention, you really can't get away with even a page. You have to find another vehicle for getting information in the hands of those who are making the decisions. And really, that's one of the jobs of the chairman, to figure out how to provide information most usefully and effectively.
I was vice chair when with Joe Nye, and we created the president's summary purely as a marketing device. thinking that if we called it the President's summary, the President might not read it, but lots of assistant secretaries would, right? So it was purely a marketing device. I don't know how good a one, but it was the best we could do.
Sounds good. I don't know how you test whether they read it or not. But,
Right.
So, Greg, one question along those lines is as the National Intelligence Council evolves, including from the time where you served under Joe Nye, and then over the next decade and two, what is your sense at that period? What differentiates the National Intelligence Council and its products, including the National Intelligence Estimates, from other analysis being done or activity being done within the U.S. intelligence community? What's the comparative advantage in your view of the NIC as opposed to other analysis coming out of the CIA, the other work being done by the clandestine service? What's the comparative advantage?
Again, a big change in 2004, 2005. So before 2004, it seems to me.
Yeah, I'm not getting to the DNI creation yet.
So in that earlier period, it seems to me that the comparative advantage of the NIC, it was doing estimates, doing longer, richer, trying to look ahead, look around corners, in a way that most other parts of the intelligence community weren't so much. It was interagency always, right? So if the president wanted to know what the CIA thought about some issue, he could ask. But typically the question came, what does the intelligence community think about this issue? And that would then lead, in that period, to a national intelligence estimate or some other art form that would be coordinated in the language of the trade, that is argued about by all the various agencies. And so you got an integrated, not always a unified view, but at least an integrated view. And that I think was important and has been important from the very beginning.
So
If I could just add,
yeah.
I think another distinction is that goes to the term strategic. It's really the estimates in particular, but other products coming out of the National Intelligence Council are mostly meant to be strategic, which doesn't necessarily mean very long term,
No.
but it means taking a broader strategic look in a way that other parts of government find it increasingly difficult to do. Policy planning staff at the state used to do that. It now, I think, by universal recognition, does it less well. It's much more operational, narrow-gauged. The things coming out of individual agencies, including CIA and the other intelligence agencies, but also the policy agencies, come up through a pipeline. It may be a broad and important pipeline, but it's not, they don't make the connections across accounts as well as the NIC, when it does its job well, can do.
So starting with Greg and then going to Bob, again, this is before the 2004 and 2003 period that we'll get to in a moment. But if we look at the 70s, for example, or the 80s, are there any successes or partial successes that you assess the NIC and its products were involved in contributing to outcomes, and how do you even think about what successes during that period as well?
Well, certainly one of the great policy successes was one in which Bob participated, and that is the aftermath events leading to the reintegration of Germany and the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. And there it seems to me that was a particularly important and useful period in intelligence policy relations. Lots of people on the policy side knew a lot about intelligence, had good connections. There was a steady stream of analysis, asking kind of what if, what next, what two or three moves down the line. So that seems to me, and it was also a very tidy and collegial administration, George H.W. Bush administration. And on both the policy and the intelligence side, that seems to me to be a pretty impressive success. Now, you had to take a strategic view, but they did a good job at taking a strategic view and keeping their eye on the main prize, which was Germany.
Actually, this is a good point to pick up on. You made the point earlier, Greg, distinguishing between truth and usefulness in the way the NIC does its work. This was a case in point. The intelligence community, and the NIC in particular, is sometimes criticized for failing to predict the fall of the USSR. Often by scholars. I know that scholarly world quite well. I was part of it. The scholarly world also failed to predict this, but never mind. The NIC was accused of that. And I think that maybe is a fair criticism. So in that sense, there was a failure of prediction. But the analysis that was provided, I went from the intelligence community. I was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Europe in the late 80s. Then I went over to the NSC as Director for European Affairs. So I went from intelligence to policy in the matter of one day. The intelligence community was doing a pretty good job throughout the 80s and earlier of charting the breakdown of the Soviet economic and political system, and even more so, the breakdown of the regimes in Eastern Europe. So it was depicting a Soviet empire in pre-revolutionary state. That was good enough. That was the kind of analysis that policymakers found useful. And then it was up to the policy side to determine what exactly do we do about this. And I think the United States was lucky to have had the first President Bush, James Baker, Brent Scowcroft around to convert strategic analysis into strategy.
That the whole fall of the Soviet Union is interesting because the intelligence community did get the details mostly right, like as the economy, but nobody ever put them together in a story about this is a country in crisis that may implode.
And the timing too, perhaps.
And the timing. But you imagine if you tried to tell that story in, say, the Reagan administration, my guess is you'd find yourself looking at observing submarines from Kamchatka Island, right? That'd be your next job. So putting the story together, interestingly enough, the people who put the story together first were people like Bob Gates and Bill Odom, and they looked at it and said, Gorbachev is destroying the Soviet Union, so therefore he must be lying. He can't be serious about these things he's doing. So they put the story together but couldn't believe it.
Well, the Cold War ends and 9/11 happens. One of the interesting components of the book is the chairman at the time, after 9/11, walking out of the CIA and heading towards another area on the CIA compound with George Tenet at the time. So, there's an example of the NIC chairman with the CIA director on the day that 9/11 happens. But one of the issues that you do deal with head on, and I'm going to start with Bob, is Iraq, which happens not long after that. And the NIC has taken a lot of hits for the famous WMD, National Intelligence Assessment. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that issue. You do spend some time talking about that particular NIE, which was, I think in your terminology, was rushed. But if you could also, after that, give us a sense of some of the perspective. I mean, I think one of the things that I found interesting in your chapter is you also highlight that Paul Pillar had written other papers in addition on the challenges, for example, of post-Saddam Iraq. So one has to look at a range of things coming out of the intelligence community, including the NIC, that look at some of the problems if the U.S. were to invade. So Iraq.
Yeah, let me sort of try to frame this fairly briefly. I spent a lot of my chapter in the book on these topics, and I think I tried to do it as honestly as I could. Let me frame it a little bit. The Iraqi WMD estimate, as I like to point out, was done 6 months before I arrived as chairman. But I lived with that estimate. I lived with it my whole 2 years as chairman. I was on a public service leave from Princeton that only lasted 2 years. That was my term. I dealt with it.
How did it feel like? Did it feel like 2 years when you were there, or 2 decades?
It felt longer. Yeah, it did. When I described that estimate, I often said, so we are the organization that produced the infamous Iraqi WMD estimate, but we also do nonfiction work. Pause. Okay. Yeah. I think that the estimate was not only rushed; it was a flawed estimate. I'm probably even harder on it than Greg, although we're both critical of it. I think to reduce a complicated story to just a few words, the main problem with the estimate is that it fell victim to hindsight bias or confirmation bias. Everybody knew, in quotes, that Iraq had WMD, actually used chemical weapons on 10 separate documented occasions. The last UN arms inspection team allowed in had identified them. The Iraqi regime had never provided evidence of their destruction, ergo, they're still there. So everybody believed that.
Including us who opposed the war.
That has very little to do with the decision to go to war. So those writing the estimate, like others, I should say, went into that task looking for evidence that would confirm something they were already pretty certain of. Had they done what scientists do, apply the negative test strategy, trying to disprove a proposition, they never would have gotten to the same conclusion. So it was a flawed estimate. And when I first went to the NIC, it was very early 2003. Of course, the first thing I did was to read the estimate. I had not read it. I had no security clearance before. So I read it. It took me a couple of sittings to get through it. And my reaction was, this is it? This is all we've got? This is all the evidence there is? I found it really unpersuasive. But I think the second part of the story is, the received wisdom now is that the National Intelligence Council produced a flawed estimate on Iraqi WMD, and that flawed estimate caused us to go to war. The first part of that statement is true, the second half of that statement is false. And I'll just run through the reasoning. How exactly did that estimate make a case for war? Did it say that Iraq had nuclear weapons and the capacity to deliver them against the United States? No, it explicitly said Iraq was years away, multiple years away from it having a nuclear weapons capacity and years away from having a ballistic missile capacity capable of delivering them. So there was no imminent nuclear threat. The other argument could be that, well, he had chemical and biological weapons, the other weapons of mass destruction, which the estimate did conclude he had. But how exactly did that pose a threat to the United States? A threat to U.S. interests, of course, we have vast interests, but how do those weapons come to the United States and cause harm to the United States? The only way you could get there is a frankly politically contrived argument that Iraq also had, in addition to WMD, active ongoing ties with terrorist organizations and was willing to give these weapons to terrorists who could then somehow get to the United States and do damage here. The intelligence community never believed that Iraq had active, meaningful ties with terrorist organizations. So that argument fell apart too. The sad truth is, we went to war for entirely different reasons. And if you read the memoirs of Don Rumsfeld, I mentioned it on page 115 of my chapter, of the interview done in Vanity Fair by Paul Wolfowitz, Bush's own memoirs, Condi Rice's own memoirs, you get a very different picture of why we went to war. WMD factored in as one of several reasons. So I think a badly flawed estimate it was, but we ought to look elsewhere for affixing blame as the decision to go to war.
One question before going to Greg is, one follow-up is, you talk a little bit also there about at some point there was inevitability to the fact that we were also going to war as well. I mean, at what point did you feel like, or did it look like, regardless of what the assessment was going to be, that there was a drumbeat anyway that we were going to go to war?
Yeah, again, by the time I got there in February 2003, this was clearly happening. The war started a month after I got there. It was clear it was coming. Actually, John Helgerson, in his chapter, which precedes mine, I think wrote very interestingly about that. Yeah. It's a mystery to him exactly when it became inevitable. I was watching this unfold from Princeton. There was this debate in the fall of 2002 with Cheney strongly defending the threat posed by Iraq, with my former boss, Brent Scowcroft, arguing forcefully against the invasion. My other former boss, James Baker, arguing somewhat more carefully against the invasion as well. So this is all part of the backdrop. I should maybe just make another point, if I may. One of the things I find most interesting about the book, of course I'm biased about the book, is that the 8 chapters are written by people who are deeply analytical, almost by definition. We're all published authors. We think seriously about these issues. They're reasonably honest. You could question whether we're as forthright as we ought to be, but we're reasonably honest. And I found it fascinating that in addition to the analytic quality, you get these personal recollections of 8 people who sat in the same chair, and some of them are just fascinating, like Helgerson's, you mentioned this already, Helgerson's walking with George Tenet on the morning of 9/11. I mean, you just don't get that too many other places. And you have Joe Nye opens his chapter by pointing out that when Jim Woolsey asked him to be chairman of the NIC, he asked, "What's the NIC?" So it's just interesting stuff.
Greg, to what degree does Iraq after 2003 impact views of the National Intelligence Council? And have we gotten well beyond that right now?
I think we're mostly beyond it. Certainly it had an effect on the NIC and the intelligence community's credibility, because the story was the one, it's not right, but it's the story Bob told, right, about the responsibility of that estimate going to war not going well. So it was a period, I think, that when the chairs after 2003 were in the business of trying to restore credibility, particularly with administrations, but also with Congress. It was a period when there were then the investigations into 9/11 and all of that produced lots of congressional activity, mostly good, but not all good. It went in the direction of much more scrutiny of NIC and processes for doing intelligence analysis. So I think we're mostly beyond that, but there was a period after 2003 when the NIC was very much, and NIC's chairs were very much involved in trying to restore credibility, believability in the eyes of administrations, Congress, and the public.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Bob for a moment, you talked a little bit about here your background in part coming in and out of academia, including Princeton. There's an interesting part, I think it's in Helgerson's chapter on page 93, where he's arguing at this point that it's helpful for the intelligence community to get outside expertise in. And he gives an example, though, of a time where Ellen Lapson identifies a first-rate China expert to bring in to help, but they get pushback from the NSC, they get denied. To what degree do you think the intelligence community, including the NIC, would benefit, does benefit, could benefit more from engagement with outsiders, including bringing them in, and how welcome has the climate been for that?
Yeah, the climate has varied over time, and Greg can talk about more recent experiences. I think every NIC chairman that we talk about in this book, that wrote chapters about this book, worked hard to build up outside ties. I know Joe Nye did when Greg was vice chairman. We established all sorts of links mainly with Americans, but not only American academics. By the time I got into the NIC chairmanship in the early 2000s, we were building up even more ties. I made a particular effort to build up ties with non-Americans to bring in some more global perspectives. So on counterterrorism, we had very active ties with Gilles Capel and others on the continent who had different angles they could bring in. It's important that the council itself, through the NIOs, also represent diverse backgrounds. I think the ideal mix, I think Greg and I are probably on the same page exactly on this one. The ideal mix is a number of serious academic stars who have some familiarity with government, but bring an outside perspective in. Those who've had serious high-level policy experience who are now brought into the intelligence world, and then those who come up through the intelligence community with a smattering of business people too. I brought in 2 very senior business people as NIOs, and I thought they added a dimension that I'd not personally seen in my time there. So I think ideally the NIC has to work hard to do that, and I think it's become harder over time. And Greg has written in his chapter and the conclusion very well about this. The forces under the intelligence reforms of 2004-5 make it a little harder to bring in outsiders. I think it'll make it a little harder for the NIC to bring in chairmen like Greg and me, not that that's the end of the world, but people who have these experiences outside the intelligence community, as academics, as policymakers, as senior congressional staff people. It's just getting a little harder for those people to be as relevant to the new definition of the NIC chairmanship as was the case in the past. And that's a loss, I think.
Just a little bit on that, Seth. The main vehicle that the NIC has been for reaching out, bringing people in. It has been first the NIC associates, now they're IC associates. In my time, there were several hundred of them from academia and think tanks, and they did all sorts of things. They would plan trips, they would write papers, they'd come and consult, and it was a really valuable set of people. At one point, they still exist. John Eikenberry at Princeton had put together a group of strategists and international relations theorists that if they'd been a single department would have been by far the best department in the world. Of course, we used them fairly frequently, and I got pushback from the budget people saying, "Why are you using this group so much?" I said, "We're lucky to get to use this group at all, and the more we can use it, the better." The other vehicle and incentive to reach out has been global trends. We haven't talked much about that. That is the...
Well, climate comes up, for example, as one example.
Yeah, absolutely. Every 4 years, the NIC has done global trends, trying to look out 5 to 20 years. And if you're trying to look out more than a year or so, none of that classified stuff on your computer is very helpful. You have to go and talk to experts on Wall Street and academia and think tanks. So in doing the one, I was lucky enough to get to do one this last time around. So the one we released in 2017, we had been to 35 countries. We touched in one way or another more than 2,000 people. We had focus groups of high-tech people in Bangalore, of students in Mexico City. It really was a great opportunity to reach out and to demonstrate that we were reaching out.
I'm going to open it up to questions in a second, but Greg, just sticking with you just for a moment, can you talk a little bit about the establishment of the Director of National Intelligence and the NIMS and what impact that had on the National Intelligence Council, since you're pretty tough on them in your chapter?
Yeah. Well, the creation of the Director of National Intelligence obviously had a big effect on the NIC. A little bit of a surprise. It came as a bit of a surprise to our predecessors that the NIC then got the assignment of doing current intelligence support for the Principals Committee and the Deputies Committee. That before the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, that had been a CIA responsibility for the DCI. So when the NIC got that current intelligence responsibility, it was a very big deal. Of the 700 pieces of paper or bullets, bytes on a screen that we did 1 year, about 400 of those were more or less directly in response to questions from the Principals Committee, but especially the Deputies Committee. Again, so if Susan Rice wanted to know what the CIA thought, she'd ask them, but typically the question came to us. What does the NIC think? So the good news about that change was that it meant we were in the thick of things. It's always hard in intelligence to know enough about policy to know what will be useful. Well, we knew that because we were in all the meetings. The challenge was that it tended to, not all the questions were purely tactical, but many of them were. And so my challenge was to find ways for us to try and answer the question that was asked, but then also say, maybe you'd like to know the answer to this question that's a little bit more strategic in the sense Bob was using. The challenge there was just simply finding the time. I remember staff meeting one great Russia analyst from INR, State Department, saying how much he enjoyed doing this more strategic piece. He said, I had 6 hours to do it. So 6 hours of grand strategic thought is not what I had in mind when I came to Washington, but it was in some ways the best we can do. The other big change then was the creation of the NIMS, National Intelligence Managers. I'm probably not the right person to talk much about that. The idea grew out of mission managers. So the original idea was mission managers for particular accounts like Iran to provide some special attention and try and knit together collection and analysis. Jim Clapper liked that idea and created national intelligence managers for all the accounts. That was still a work in progress, shall we say. As one of my deputies put it, there is the black Suburban problem, and that is who gets to ride in the black Suburban to go to White House meetings. and that set up a little bit of competition between the NIOs and the NIMs. The general line was if it was substance, as most White House meetings are, then it was the NIO. If it's intelligence process or collection or other things, then it should be the NIM. But that was a kind of generally friendly, continuing guerrilla war in my time.
Great. Well, the last question, Greg, you're welcome to answer, or we can punt it to audience questions before I go, is I'm going to bring this to today because now we're in a slightly different position where the intelligence community and the FBI are under some onslaught from some policymakers. There's been some criticism by the president of the intelligence community. What's your sense about today, what the particular challenges are of the U.S. intelligence community, including the National Intelligence Council in 2019 Washington?
Well, let me see. I think between now and January 2021, there's no chance of things getting better. So I'm very pessimistic. This is what it is. The President of the United States simply does not want to have analysis of any kind, and certainly not from the intelligence community, but not from anywhere else either. I'm sorry to speak so bluntly. On the medium to longer term, I'm more optimistic. I think the same factors that caused Harry Truman, also not terribly gifted as an international theorist when he took office, the same factors that caused him to come to the realization that he needed a strategic intelligence analytic function, and that this function needed to be placed outside the main policy agencies in order to provide support to policy, but also a somewhat detached check on the ambitions of policymakers. He recognized the need for that in one form or another, to one degree or another. Every president since has also understood that need. Some used it more effectively than others, but they all recognize that need. I think we will get back to a situation in which, for the sake of government coherence and effective policy, this recognition will come back. It won't be the same as before, where I'm not talking about a nostalgic return to yesteryear, but a return to this basic understanding that we need a strategic intelligence analytic function, and it needs to be built into the policymaking process, not just out as some sort of detached think tank, but integrated into the way policy is developed. Around the NSC's table, when the seniors meet, the intelligence community ought to be an active, interactive participant in that process, and on every issue. So I think I'm hopeful we'll get back to that fundamental understanding.
All right, why don't we open it up to questions? We've got microphones. If you could just wait for microphone to come on. We just start right here. Right up front.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. I was a member of the staff of O&E when it was abolished in the fall of 1973. And those of us on the staff were very angry because all of the focus from Schlesinger and Colby and the White House was on the board of national estimates. We had a staff of 35 very senior officers and a few junior officers that was first rate, and it was abolished along with the board. And I think it took the NIOs a long, long time to develop their own staff resources. I'm not sure they ever got the support that the O&E staff gave in its day.
Is there a question?
Do you agree that there is a problem about staffing the work of the NIOs?
I think so. And you want to jump in, Greg?
Sure. Now what happens is basically there are NIOs who, in principle, as Bob said, come from inside, outside, from the intelligence community, from other policy agencies, from academia, and then there are their deputies. So the heart and soul of the NIC now are the deputy NIOs, of which there are about maybe 50 or 60, and they all come from another intelligence agency. And they are really quite wonderful. I had a cyber analyst from the Secret Service. I didn't even know the Secret Service did cyber. I had a wonderful young analyst from NYPD. So they really are terrific, but they only come for 2-year secondments, basically. And so one of my challenges was to try and find ways to remove from them some of the administrative burdens that they ended up inheriting so they could be full-time intelligence analysts. I thought at the end of my tenure that if we were going to really do more national intelligence estimates, more strategic work, we probably needed a pool of like 25 more analysts who wouldn't do projects on their own, but would work with NIOs and deputy NIOs to do those longer, not necessarily longer, but broader, more strategic pieces, which kept getting pushed rightward in the timetable due to the press of the immediate. So that would have been my, I think, response to the staffing challenge.
I feel pretty much the same way. There's a weakness in both models. The danger of having a large staff is that you get too detached from the rest of the intelligence community. It's self-contained. The danger of having too small a staff is that you're now hostage to whatever the agencies provide, and you don't have the capacity to push back as powerfully as you should. This is one reason that estimates have become so cumbersome, so long in gestation, so cautious in judgments, because every agency wants to have a piece of the action going forward, and they come out not as useful as they could. There's no real way, I think, to devise the perfect system, but I take what you said about what's been lost.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in here. Why don't we start with the first one right here?
Thank you. I'm Leon Weinjob, a retired member of the Foreign Service who also had a tour in state intelligence. I wonder if you could talk about the role of the intelligence community in the decision on the expansion of NATO. Particularly, what would be the value added of the new members, and what would be the anticipated response of the Russian Federation?
I didn't fully understand the question.
So I think the role of the intelligence community in analyzing the expansion of NATO, both the upsides to expanding as well as the reaction of Russia, which has some direct relevance to Russia's reaction today. Yeah.
You know, this happened before my return. I was involved with sort of the initial discussions when I was in the policy side about the first wave of NATO enlargement to include Poland, Hungary, and the then Czechoslovakia. The next wave of 10 new members, and then flirtations with Georgia and Ukraine came after my first time, my time in the policy side, and then before my return to the NIC. So I can't really answer your question, maybe Greg can, but I will say this. I think too little analytic work was done on that question. I personally was a big proponent of the first wave. I was not a fan of the second wave. I thought it was done too cavalierly to bring in countries that would be very hard to defend if we were ever actually called on to defend them, and which countries that didn't really contribute much militarily to the mission of the alliance. I thought those countries needed to find their security in some other way than NATO membership.
I think that's right. It seems to me there was probably too much of a tendency to say this is essentially a policy question, not an intelligence question. If these countries want to join NATO, then it's a policy choice to let them in or not. I think some more analysis of the implications, particularly the reaction, would have been important, was important. And I think that the voices of caution about continued NATO expansion tended to be a lot of Russia specialists, including those inside the intelligence agencies.
So Greg, just to be clear, are you and Bob, you're talking less about the Poland, about
Right.
Czech Republic, and more about the Baltics, for example?
Yeah, the Baltics were a tough case, obviously, because they very much wanted to be in.
Yeah.
They had lots of qualifications for being in. But then once you did that, then you got to our current circumstance where...
So got to Russian territory, too.
Yeah, exactly, got to Russian territory.
It's actually a very interesting question. I think, I suspect that to the extent the intelligence community was involved, and I really don't know, it probably didn't do very well. This is not the kind of question the intelligence community is very good at. It would have required a really intense interaction between policymakers and intelligence to answer some specific questions. Otherwise, the intelligence community would, as Greg had indicated, taken a step back and say, this really isn't an intelligence matter, it's a matter of politics. As it was, the Clinton administration's view was, this is democratic enlargement. It was done under the banner of democratic enlargement, as if NATO were some sort of democratic club rather than an alliance.
Right here.
Thank you both very much. My name's Sam Rising. I'm from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I thought we were hammering home some really interesting points. One about talking about the NICS assessments prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the NICS assessments of Iraq's WMD program. One of the things that I think is a particular challenge for specifically ODNI today is we're living in this era of big data. The volume, the veracity, the velocity, and the variety of data is changing. And I think it's making this job of integration and storytelling that much harder for the intelligence community. Could you explain or expand on how you think the NICS job or its role might change or it gets harder in this era of big data? How do you integrate that story? How do you craft the story better and tell it better? Well, in this case, in a very political environment.
Yeah, really good questions. I'm not sure I have a very satisfactory answer. I think that obviously the era of big data is with us. It's really important. I think it's a great boon on the whole for the intelligence community, as it is for lots of other organizations out there. It does mean that the nature of the process has to change pretty dramatically with a lot more artificial intelligence, a lot more processing. So that's the challenge the community faces in terms of method, I think. And from my perspective, it's not doing badly. It's not yet Google, but it's not doing so badly. And it is interesting. In some ways, the whole paradigm for me changes. We have a Cold War paradigm that says information is in short supply, mostly secrets are relevant. Now we have a world in which information is abundant, right? Every camera's on every street corner practically. And so dealing with a world in which data is not scarce, but abundant, maybe too abundant, that's a big change in paradigm, I think. And in some ways, through things like activity-based intelligence, the community, I think, is doing some pretty interesting initiatives at trying to use that abundant data. The other challenge, as you suggest, is how do you make that credible? If you've got a lot of automation and processing, how do you make it even credible to analysts, much less credible to policy people? And that, I think, is a related, really important challenge. In some ways, we used to think of quality control being done on products. In some ways now, it seems to me we're moving toward a period when quality control will rest with analysts. You'll have to have confidence in their judgment and their ability to take all this automated data and see some sense in it.
Yeah, it's not just the use of data, it's the fact that this amount of information is mainly outside of U.S. government hands. It's out there somewhere, which makes the need to reach out effectively all the more important. There's a kind of an analogy with the State Department reports officers. The people out in posts writing reporting cables. Well, this has fallen out of vogue because why would people at the NSC want to read that when they've got lots of other sources? The reason now is a little bit different. It's not that these are the sole sources of information, but they're more likely to be the best sources of reliable information that can sift out the wheat from the chaff of all the mountains of information out there that flood in all the time. You need reports officers more than ever to help make sense of this world out there. And it really is a different way of defining the mission of the intelligence analyst or the State Department reporting officer.
Greg, one other issue that's related to this is, and it comes up, for example, in Tom's chapter, where he talks about the national security implications of global climate change. But there are other issues like that, diseases and analysis of the spreading of Ebola, for example, the melting of the Arctic, water resources. To what degree, as chairman, did you deal with any of these other non-hard security issues from the NICS perspective?
Actually, quite a lot. I thought that the work we did on those issues was really quite important. We'd occasionally get complaints from Congress. Why are you worrying about this? Why aren't you worrying about really hard security issues? But these do have big security implications. And I was also struck by how other people from other government agencies found our work very useful. It was all unclassified, so they could use it with their colleagues from around the world, but it had the authoritative ring of being an intelligence product. So I remember being on a panel with a senior AID person about water, and I had paged quickly through an estimate a piece we'd done several years before. He could practically quote it. He knew it very well. So I found that work important, and I think the fact that the NIC, and the NIC has continued in the annual threat testimony to hold firm that yes, climate change does have, we're not experts on the science, but yes, climate change does have enormous national security implications. I think that's been an important string of continuity in the last 10 years or so of the NIC.
Okay, question here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I've had several occasions in which I watched a product go from the analyst who actually knew something about the subject, up through the chain of command, out to the laterals, out to the other agency's chain of commands, out to the other agency's laterals, and watched a perfect analysis lose all its edges. Happy got changed to glad, he will got changed to he might, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that actually arrived at the NIC was such a pathetic piece of pablum that I was in tears. And they never even bothered to take the original brilliant analysis and staple it to the back of the community product, just so that the policymaker could get a shot at what's really happening. Do any of your authors comment on that long-standing problem?
I think it's a problem we all faced. I was struck on my very first, my second job in government on the National Security Council staff, when the U.S. government in general was doing a lot more analysis, policy analysis and intelligence analysis than it does these days, but how as things moved up the daisy chain, all that sort of got lost. And you find these seniors in policy meetings sort of flying by the seat of their pants. Similar challenge for intelligence, I think. We've seen all the chapters, the chairs have wrestled with that challenge to try and make estimates cleaner, clearer, punchier, more declaratory. Bob mentioned some of the innovations that people have done with summaries, but in general, I think all of the chairs have wrestled with that challenge. Unfortunately, one of the bad things about the WMD estimate was it was pretty successful in being declaratory and not having weasel words, just when it should have had some of those weasel words.
Yeah, this is a big problem. As Greg said, I think every chair, certainly all the ones represented in our book, wrestled with this. None of us very successfully. We tried hard. Estimates take way too long. There's way too much time to fiddle with the words to try to make them as careful as possible. It's related to the ever-present specter of intelligence failure that's in the back of everyone's mind. So you want to write things in such a way that they cover every potential contingency. You use some sort of muddy consensus rather than bold statements. I think there was a time, actually when Greg was vice chair and Joe and I was chair, that I thought it did the best in my experience. It was a different time, a different era, but estimates were turned around much more quickly. There was simply no time to change happy to glad and glad back to happy and all that stuff. And they were done in response to a specific urgent request. The National Security Council needs a quick turnaround national estimate on Bosnia-Herzegovina 2 weeks from today. And that sort of focused the mind and produced somewhat better products.
All right, we are sadly out of time. But again, I want to urge people again to buy Truth to Power. It really is an interesting collection of National Intelligence Council leaders and their personal experiences during their time running the National Intelligence Council. As I noted earlier, Bob and Greg are around after this event and are happy to sign copies of the book. And if you can join me in thanking them. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it was a treat. Talking about your book is always welcome.
Great.
And I just realized John Helgerson is there in the third row.
Yes,
I
we
didn't,
should have-
I didn't see you, John.